You're listening to ayahuascapodcast.com.
Politics follows public opinion and not the other way around. Politics was 30 years behind public opinion when it came to changing things. So things like, homosexuality, things like women having, certain rights, certain things that we look at now and go, well, that's just crazy that was illegal. Now, with modern media, things are much more accelerated. So if public opinion starts to move and says, right, we need a fresh look at psilocybin, we need to look at some of these compounds and look at, what they can do, because the data isn't there. Academics tell me the data's not there. We can have people having personal experiences and anecdotal evidence and all the rest of it, but what they're saying to me is that the data's not there. The policymakers won't change unless the data's there. But then the data won't be there unless the public opinion's there and the people are doing it to create the data.
In this episode of ayahuascapodcast.com, I have a conversation with Joe Vaughan. We talk about legalization of psilocybin in the UK, Joe's ayahuasca experiences. We talk about different ayahuasca traditions. Talk about him living in a train spotting era and how psychedelics could have helped. Talk about mental health crisis and so much more. Enjoy this episode. This episode is sponsored by Lawira Ayahuasca Retreat. At Lawira, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. Lawira, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you. Hi guys, and welcome to Ayahuasca Podcast. As always, with you, the host, Sam Believ. Today, I am interviewing Joe Vaughan. Joe Vaughan. Yeah, Vaughan. Joe Vaughan is a UK-based comedian, writer, and advocate for psychedelic medicine legalization. After witnessing psilocybin transform his friend's life, he became a prominent voice in the Thank You Plant Medicines movement, working to reduce stigma around plant medicine in UK specifically. Joe, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
Joe, before we begin talking about psychedelics and such, tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you find yourself in that line of work?
Yeah, I think I have to go back quite a few generations. Is that originally my grandfather came from Nigeria to Scotland in the 90s, just after the Second World War. So that had a huge impact on kind of my life growing up in Scotland, because there were not many black people in Scotland at that particular time. So I kind of grew up in an environment which was kind of pretty harsh, pretty racist, fairly tough kind of environment in a port town called Leith. I don't know if you've heard of Trainspotting, the book and the film by Irvin Welsh. But that is my experience. That is my life. Reading that book is like kind of literally someone writing you the narrative of your own story, right? But I had always had a kind of slightly different kind of perspective on life because of my Nigerian family. Because it was quite an unusual and a kind of unique situation. Like, I never knew my granddad, but my mother is kind of obviously of mixed parentage, which was, as I say, very unusual in Scotland. So I always felt kind of, simultaneously a kind of insider, but I kind of had a kind of slightly kind of outsider's view of things and a kind of wider kind of perspective because of my family upbringing. So, as I say, I grew up in Scotland, in Leith, in the 1970s, 1980s, and kind of peak kind of train spotting era, kind of dysfunction. Grew up around a lot of drug taking and violence and alcoholism. There were some downsides as well. But it was a kind of quite an interesting environment to grow up in. So following that kind of upbringing, I ended up moving to England, where I kind of went to university and studied, and then moved around a bit. I lived in Paris for a while, and then lived in West Africa for a while, and had a kind of a job which involved a lot of traveling, and so my kind of life has been a sort of a kind of an exploration of kind of stuff. I always felt like I wanted to just go and see stuff. Do cool things and see stuff was my objective, and I've kind of largely achieved that.
So in the intro, I mentioned that your friend's story and recovery through psilocybin was a big inspiration for you. Can you maybe tell us that story?
Yeah, so I mean, where I used to live in Edinburgh, in Leith, there was a part of the local park, literally where we all played and grew up as kids. And every September, we would see these kind of people, kind of dressed slightly differently, kind of wandering around, like kind of looking at the ground. And I didn't realize they were actually picking, the kind of naturally occurring, psilocybin, liberty cat mushrooms that grow in the UK. But there was a field in the part of Edinburgh and Leith where I grew up. There was a field where magic mushrooms would grow. So we'd see people picking them. So it was kind of that was my sort of first sort of not direct experience of psilocybin, but kind of over the years of traveling and going to Amsterdam, psilocybin mushrooms were legal, and you could buy them in shops in Amsterdam. And so when you went to Amsterdam for a weekend, you would take psilocybin mushrooms, legally. Not the best environment, not the best setting. It's got to be said. But that was just kind of part of what you did when you went to Amsterdam for the weekend. So there's a very good friend of mine who I met in England when I went to university, who had a very, very difficult life. He'd been in children's homes. He grew up around violence and neglect, and he'd become a drug addict. An intravenous, drug addict, a speed. First of all, it was through speed, amphetamines, and then heroin, and ultimately through methadone. He'd been on methadone for maybe 20 years. Hardcore kind of a drug addict, and he'd never been out of the UK ever. He'd never had a passport. He'd never been out of the UK. He was practically destitute. He was living on the streets, more or less. And I kind of thought, right, I need to do something here. So I thought, right, I'm going to get him a passport. I'm going to get him his passport. And we're going to go somewhere. We're going to go out of the country somewhere. He'd never been out of the UK, never had a passport, nothing. So we went to Amsterdam, and we had an experience with psilocybin mushrooms. And it was one of those kind of, quite a euphoric kind of evening, one of those evenings on psilocybin mushrooms, not a kind of sit alone in the dark, deep introspection, more of a kind of a quite a hedonistic, quite an enjoyable evening of hilarity and big emotions, but a lot of laughing and a lot of kind of enjoyment. And after that experience, my friend, I might get emotional talking about this because he's no longer with us, but he wrote me a letter to say that evening had basically transformed his life, and that he found a new purpose, and he found a new enjoyment, and he found a new motivation, to be alive. And following that, he started to, he'd always had an interest in music. He's a punk, an original punk, or an oi boy, as he called himself. And so he started writing music. He started writing songs and performing songs, and performing at festivals. I mean, he wasn't headlining at Glastonbury, but he was performing in festivals. His music that he'd written and he was performing, and his life just went on a completely different trajectory, from the kind of practically homeless, destitute, almost, literally dying. He had a very, enjoyable kind of next, say, 10 years. Unfortunately, he did pass away in the end through, the alcoholism, and he'd been on methadone for, as I say, a very long time. And eventually his liver did pack up. But there was enough in that experience for me to go, well, wait a minute, there's something, if that can transform his life so fundamentally, there's got to be something in this. And that kind of that was about maybe nearly 20 years ago. And I think, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. So I was part of the rave scene. So, obviously that had its own sort of associations with, sort of psychedelics and other recreationals. But that was just part of what we did. But so that was more kind of hedonistic, but a kind of much more conscious kind of feeling around the work came to me maybe about 20 years ago through my experience with my friend.
Well, it sounds that It definitely prolonged his life and probably made his quality of life much higher. And yeah, with the mushrooms, I've had experiences that where it feels less of a ceremony, even when you do it in a ceremonial setting. It feels less of a ceremony sometimes, and more of a celebration, kind of with the main messages being life is to be enjoyed, and there's a lot to be enjoyed, kind of that positivity. So I'm a big fan of that medicine as well. I think that in a perfect world where everything is legal, I see like a wellness protocol for an average individual living in the Western world being something like one ayahuasca retreat a year, and then maybe one smaller mushroom experience every quarter or so to keep you sane, and then a lot of integration and a lot of therapy and other modalities like breath work and tapping and you name it. There's so many now. So yeah, it's a beautiful medicine. Talking about medicines, I know you yeah.
So I just say one thing on that. I mean, the Amsterdam experience is quite a cautionary tale, because they were selling very high strength, mushrooms in shops, and people were getting hold of them with no preparation, no understanding, no real kind of sense about what it was they were doing, and it was causing a lot of problems. So that kind of free for all thing is, as it was in Amsterdam at the time, is probably something that we really want to caution against. Because very, very clear on this is that these compounds can be so strong, so powerful, so destabilizing that they really need to be handled with care. So that whole kind of well-known kind of process of you prepare yourself, you do the right preparations, understand, you make sure your setting and intentions are there. You do it with people you trust at a dose level that you can handle, and then obviously sometimes people need support on the other side of it as well. Because I think it's dangerous. Certainly, I would would not necessarily advise that we go back to that situation in Amsterdam where it was a free for all, because it kind of almost delegitimizes the work that we're trying to do, and the fact that we're trying to kind of legitimize this whole enterprise, and in a sense like rebrand it kind of away from people getting kind of off their heads in a hedonistic setting and kind of actually taking this kind of seriously. So I'm as big an advocate for the dance and the magic of these things as anyone else, but I just would definitely urge caution when it comes to it.
Thank you for adding that. Definitely thank you for adding that note to it. When I personally speak about mushroom use, I'm talking ceremonial use, meaning with some kind of indigenous tradition. But of course, there's also medical use. But in case of recreational use, it has to be done very carefully. I mean, Amsterdam is a nice city, but no city should be used for working with plant medicines, except for maybe like a microdose. And still, I mean, there's something special about being in the nature and being in a safe container, both with a sitter or preferably several, and maybe a ceremonial fire, and as you said, preparation, integration, all of the good stuff. So yeah, definitely not to get people confused. Don't go ahead and just buy mushrooms and do your stuff. That's not what we're talking about. Yeah, it's not for everyone as well. If your mental state is not great and you're very shaky, then it can disbalance you even more, especially with I've never ever taken psychedelics outside of ceremonial settings, so it's hard for me to imagine, but I can see that somebody at the festival or in the city with a lot of people, you can get paranoia and maybe even worse things. But talking about medicines and ceremonial setting, I know you've also had some experience with ayahuasca. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and similarities or differences you notice with your mushroom work?
Sure. So I've been fortunate enough to go to Peru 3 times now. So the first time was at the Temple of the Way of Light, which is near Iquitos in Peru, and that was my first experience of a kind of ceremonial setting. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of really put it into words. I mean, I know that we always use the words kind of ineffable, and it is in a sense, but I'll do my best. So when we did, talking about preparation, experience and integration, the preparation that we did there was actually very good. They did sit down and explain, what it was good, what was going to happen, how the ceremonies were going to take place, etc. So we felt, fairly kind of strong going in, the diet, diet preparation, etc. Flower baths and meditation, some yoga and stuff. So we were kind of fairly well set up to go into the experience. There were 5 Shipibo healers in the ceremony, probably in a ceremony of about 20 to 25. I'll say max 25. So it was 1 healer to every 5, participants, and each healer would go around every individual and sing an ikaro to them, and kind of face to face on the mat. So they would have a kind of central ikaro that would be sung at the start, for the in the maloka and the space, and then you'd have an individual, like I say, ikaro by each individual healer. And it's quite hard to explain to people that, when you're sitting in the dark, kind of feeling, under the influence of a powerful medicine, and someone's kind of singing to you in the dark in a language that you don't understand, but yet you understand everything that they're saying to you. It's a very, very strange thing to try and explain to someone. So, I didn't have, a kind of a traditional kind of psychedelic experience in the first sort of 4 ceremonies, the 5 ceremonies in total. The first 4 ceremonies were very much a kind of bodily sensation, no all bells and whistles, as we say, psychedelic traditional experience. But in each ikaro that was being sung to me, it felt like my kind of my personality, myself, my the individual that I am was being kind of rebuilt, kind of very much from the kind of bottom up. So on the first ceremony, it felt like they were singing to the kind of the baby me, like the small child me, and like a lullaby, and kind of making it feel safe and secure. And then the second ceremony felt like they were singing to, maybe the kind of 5-year-old me, the 3 to 5-year-old me. And then the third ceremony, it felt like they were singing to each ceremony kind of built on the previous one. And each ikaro, even from all the different healers that were singing to me, it felt like they were singing to kind of those kind of neglected, damaged parts of myself. And it's quite extraordinary, as I say. No kind of visions or nothing kind of extreme in that sense, but so powerful as an experience. And then in the 5th ceremony, there was a bit more kind of a visual thing. But I remember very clearly one of the healers singing to me, and all I was hearing was you have conditional love, you have conditional love, you have conditional love. This is what you must remember. It was as clear. It was as clear as if someone was speaking to me in English and saying this to me, but it was being sung in whatever the Shipibo language is. Excuse me, I don't remember what you call it, but that was my experience of it. So at the end of that, kind of the 5th ceremony, it felt like I'd had a complete, kind of refresh, reboot, kind of full MOT, as they say, full kind of service of the machine and the psyche. And I came away just with a real sense of renewal, and yeah, just extraordinary experience. And also, I mean, the people I met, some very good friends, people that I call great friends now in the group. As you will probably know from your own experience, the kind of a lot of the medicine is in the group itself. It's the kind of how people share about the interactions people have, the kind of triggering that goes on, the kind of the little do you know what I mean? It's the group itself. That group dynamic is quite important as well. So I was very lucky. I had a great group. So that was the first time. Second time was a guy called Don Howard Lawler. He had a place called Spirit Quest. Spirit Quest still exists, but Don Howard is sadly no longer with us. But he was he used to work with Wachuma as well. So he'd work with ayahuasca and Wachuma, and he was kind of trying to keep the kind of the kind of process that had been developed and was used in Chavin, the kind of the mountain civilization in Chavin, and he'd taken a lot of those practices and tried to kind of keep them going and recreate them in his center in Iquitos. So I did a Wachuma dieta after that, which was hugely powerful experience as well. It was quite an interesting dynamic because there's some fairly high profile psychedelics advocates who were there, because it was looking likely it was going to be Howard's last what do you call it, Wachuma sort of dieta. It looked like it was going to be his last one, because he was in failing health. So there was some quite high profile people there. So again, that was part of the kind of medicine of it all. That it was quite an interesting dynamic amongst the people who were there. But I had a really kind of powerful breakthrough experience on Wachuma. But as Howard says, it's like a feather, Wachuma. It's like a heavy feather, So I had a really powerful breakthrough kind of experience, very subtle, with Wachuma, because obviously it's very different from ayahuasca. So that was my second experience, and then I was at the end of last year. I went back to Peru, to the jungle, to Pucallpa this time, to Don Jose Campos's place. I don't know if you know about Don Jose Campos, but he was in jail in Mexico. You might have heard that story. About the Peruvian healer who was in jail in Mexico for nearly a year. He's out of jail now, which is great. But he's got a place near Pucallpa, so I went to his place, and that was more of a proper dieta, where you were, very very basic food while you were there, minimal interaction. The Temple of the Way of Light was slightly more. You'd have interactions, you would eat together, etc. Whereas this was a bit more, maybe traditional or rugged. I don't know what you'd call it, but it was literally, off grid. Very basic food, minimal interactions, and kind of more of a proper dieta than what I'd done up till that point. Again, hugely powerful experience. I felt a lot of release in that particular experience. Again, I don't really get hugely visionary experiences, shall we say, but I do get these kind of profound breakthroughs and insights. This one in particular was around kind of trust, and being able to kind of feel able to kind of let go of what is no longer serving me at an energetic level, like things that build up in your energy system that just are not necessary for your functioning, shall we say. So I had a real kind of energetic release there. We did a ceremony on Halloween, which was one of the most extraordinary nights of my life. Darkest night, the night before, maybe night when it was full moon. So the first ceremony was done in full moon. So obviously the jungle is bathed in light. But this ceremony on Halloween was just the darkest night I've ever, seen, ever not, you're not seeing anything. You can't see in front of your face. And there was some very, very powerful kind of energetics in the ceremony. And so, yeah, that was hugely powerful. Then the fifth ceremony was done in the daytime. And there was a thunderstorm, jungle thunderstorm were kind of moving around a lot. But in this last ceremony, the thunderstorm was right above the Maloca. And I've never done ayahuasca in the daytime. It was just, there's no, I would struggle to try and describe it as the energy. You could see the energy in the forest with obviously with the power of the storm and the medicine and the music. And Don Jose Campos does extraordinary work with music, not just traditional sung Icaros, but different types of music that he incorporates in ceremony as well. So yeah, anyway, 3 times to Peru, each very different, but each completely transformative in their own way.
Thank you for sharing that. Few things come to mind. Is like number one, you're mentioning how different ayahuasca is in its. It is still a psychedelic, and it can get very psychedelic. But a lot of times, especially when you begin working with it, people expect this big explosion, but in reality, it just kind of softly goes to your body, gets to know you, scans you, and shows you stuff. And a lot of times, You mentioned group dynamic as well, but we have word circles, and then somebody comes to the word circle after first ceremony and they say, well, I am not connected to the medicine because they haven't seen the visions. And then they proceed describing a complete and very beautiful ayahuasca experience of healing and understanding and learning. So it's something that we deal with every day here at the retreat, which is normal. I understand the hesitancy, but you can get very psychedelic, so much so that too much for you, and you might regret sort of wanting to get it so psychedelic. But it's an interesting medicine because with mushrooms, for example, if you take certain amount of certain mushrooms, you're gonna have a certain experience. With ayahuasca, it's it can be this, it can be that, it can be something completely different. Another thing that comes to mind is that you say, you went to Peru 3 times and you had 3 different kind of ceremonies just within Peru itself. There's some places there's Icaros, other places there's ceremonial music, some places it's mix of both. Like in our case, our shaman in Colombian tradition, he does Icaros when he blesses the medicine and whenever he needs to organize the energy in the room. But then he actually sings ceremonial music, so using a lot of indigenous instruments, but some of the songs are in Spanish, and it's but it's still he guides the ceremony through the music. And what comes to me is how great it is that not only the ayahuasca tradition survived, as opposed to, let's say, in UK you saw people collecting those mushrooms. I can imagine ancient Celtic people must have had a tradition and a sacrament around it, and maybe I can ask you about that later. But it did not survive. It was uprooted. You would be burned at stake and stuff like that. But here, not only the traditions survive, but there's so many of them. Like there's within Colombia alone, there's four or five different tribes that work with ayahuasca, or jahe, which is a Colombian name for ayahuasca, or ambihuasca is another name. But also within those tribes, there are different kinds of tribes, and they have their own little accents, and it's all traditional. There's many ways to skin a cat, so to speak, but we're kind of lucky to have some traditions being preserved for us as not being part of the tradition, to be now allowed in it and learn and be able to maybe even go back and recover your own tradition. So what do you think about that ancient mushroom tradition? Because in Europe there's a lot of symbology around mushroom, including in not only Europe, India, ancient Greece. What do you think? Was there a tradition? Have you been able to find something perhaps?
Yeah, just to back to that point about the different traditions, you go to a Catholic mass and it's sung in Latin and it's very somber and all the rest of it. But you can also go to kind of a Southern Baptist where everyone's jumping around and dancing around. Essentially, that they're just celebrating in a different way. So I kind of that as an example to people to say that if you want to sit with the Yawanawa, for example, would be a very different experience from sitting with a kind of Shipibo and so forth. But it's all celebrating the same thing. In terms of this is a tricky one actually. The question about what was happening over here. I mean, they were growing everywhere, right? So they grow in Scotland, they grow in England, they grow in Wales. They're everywhere. But I've asked at conferences, I've asked people who kind of study this stuff, academics, what do they think about the kind of druids? What do they think about different mushroom cults, traditions, etc.? And you draw a complete blank. I can't find any literature. And I've been having discussions with friends and colleagues and thinking, right, this is something we might want to kind of have a look into, but probably quite time consuming given the fact it's that it's not immediately obvious how it was being used. But I think it's kind of safe to assume that it was. Obviously, we have kind of sacred sites here, that kind of defy explanation. In terms of the way they're positioned and so forth. So, I mean, there's obviously different types of communications being had and different levels of technological capability. But, I'll be brutally honest with you, I have not been able to find anything yet. And I hope someone will one day come and say, there's a rich treasure trove of information over here, and then I'd, have to look at it. But I think just now our kind of working hypothesis is that, yes, for sure, they must have been using them.
Have you tried asking the mushrooms themselves?
That's actually a very good question. No, that's not something I have asked. But next time I'm, somewhere in a kind of legal jurisdiction, and we can have a look at it. If I'm in Holland, I might well do that. That might be the question to ask.
Yeah, well, when it comes to legalization, for example, here in Colombia, the medicines that have been used here traditionally are legal because there are tribes that practice them. For example, San Pedro and ayahuasca are legal when you have an indigenous shaman. However, mushrooms are decriminalized, but you cannot serve them to people. And there is a tribe, it's called Emberachami, that used to work with mushrooms, but they lost their tradition. So now they're trying to recover the tradition because, here you have, I believe it's golden teacher or psilocybe cubensis that grows here everywhere. Like I'm looking from the window to the field. I know in that field, in the cow dung, you're going to find those mushrooms. So I believe that maybe if recovering that tradition would also possibly help you legalizing or decriminalizing, or as you were explaining, changing the status of that drug or medicine. So how is your legalization effort going? And tell our listeners exactly what you're doing and how are you planning to achieve it?
So one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about that, I don't know if you came across the work of the late great Kalinde E, who was an advocate for, kind of very high dose psilocybin, experiences from Detroit, an African American from Detroit, who again sadly is no longer with us, but he advocated for kind of high dose psilocybin experiences, and he used to organize a what he called the Food of the Gods tour to Mexico. Where they would go to the site of the thunder mushrooms, like where the lightning would strike the mountain, and apparently around there the mushrooms would grow, and he would advocate to go and do that. So there's something that I've always been it's been in my mind, that you're part of the world. Be very interested in that. In terms of the status of our work and on what is called psilocybin access rights. And so we're kind of a volunteer group. We've got connections within the kind of political kind of environment. The decision to reschedule psilocybin has been sitting in the UK government for quite a long time now. Like we had an administration that was fairly open to kind of new ideas. Are we depriving ourselves of opportunities commercially? Are we depriving ourselves of opportunities in terms of research? Are we depriving ourselves of opportunities in terms of finding solutions to currently problems for which there isn't a solution? So there was a kind of an openness in government to kind of pursue these kind of new kind of areas of inquiry, but then the regime, the government kind of fell down a rabbit hole of quite strange ideas, like they wanted to start deporting asylum seekers, not deporting, they wanted to move asylum seekers to Rwanda. And it caused, so people would arrive on these, small boats that cross the English Channel from France into England on these dinghies, on these rubber, dinghy boats, right? And then what they were saying to them was like, well, you can arrive in England, but we're going to send you to Rwanda. As a sort of a way to sort of try and discourage them from coming, right? And it caused a huge kind of political problem, and here, because it was just a very strange thing to want to do. So that decision to reschedule psilocybin, which has been sitting there just waiting for someone in the Home Office, I don't know what you might call it, the Minister of the Interior in European countries, we call it the Home Secretary, the person that's in charge of homeland security and immigration and things like that. That the minister in that department had the kind of the instrument ready to sign and go, right, okay, well, psilocybin then moves. But apparently they just sat on it for a long time because they were really bogged down with this kind of whole Rwanda issue, and the department was quite dysfunctional, and our government became quite dysfunctional in its later years. So it's kind of close, and there's we've had politicians talk about psilocybin. There's a Labour MP in the UK who advocates for a fresh look at psilocybin because she's used it to treat her PTSD. had a terrible event happen in our life, and then had PTSD as a result, and then was able to find part of a solution, to the issue of PTSD using psilocybin. Now, obviously, you mentioned before different complementary therapies, like breath work, meditation, cold, hot, tapping, whatever it is. There's a whole suite of tools that you can use in conjunction with the medicine work to kind of to reach a kind of a better place with whatever it is troubling you. But she's actually spoken in the Parliament around psilocybin. The Prime Minister at the time, Rishi Sunak, answered a question about psilocybin. There are also other politicians and people involved in the political kind of field who've talked about it, who've looked at it. It's been on the TV. So we're kind of quite a strange place here in the UK, where it's kind of known, it's kind of talked about, but no one's really been brave enough. No one's really thought, right, I'm going to be the person that puts pen to paper and signs this off. Everyone's kind of watching their back a little bit. No one wants to be the person that kind of makes the move. We're having similar issues with other organisations trying to get, sort of charity status. The charity commission is a bit like, shit, if I sign this, is it going to harm my career? So I guess it's the problem with like career politicians. Are more interested in their careers than they're interested in actually doing something, potentially for the good of good of the country. So the thing is that I studied politics. Politics was my major at university, right? And I always was aware that politics follows public opinion and not the other way around, right? And they used to say that the rule was that politics was 30 years behind public opinion when it came to changing things. So things like homosexuality, things like women having certain rights, certain things that we look at now and go, well, that's just crazy that was illegal. It's crazy that homosexuality was illegal, however many years ago, not in the not too distant past. It's crazy to think that, but it took a long time for us to get there. Now, with modern media, things are much more accelerated. So if public opinion starts to move and says, right, we need a fresh look at psilocybin, we need to look at some of these compounds and look at what they can do, because the data isn't there. People, academics tell me the data's not there. We can have people having personal experiences and anecdotal evidence and all the rest of it, but what they're saying to me is that the data's not there. So the policymakers won't change unless the data's there. But then the data won't be there unless the public opinion's there and the people are doing it to create the data. Do you see what I mean? So we're in a sort of a bit of a catch-22. So what I'm trying to do is trying to kind of raise awareness outside of the traditional, I guess, psychedelics community, because I think outside of our psychedelics community, there's awareness is quite low in the general population. If you were to ask 100 people, just ordinary people on the street, what do they know about psilocybin, ayahuasca, you'd probably, at most you might get, oh, I've heard of microdosing, or, oh, I saw something on TV about that, but I can't remember what it was. It's not something which is really in the public consciousness. And as soon as you say magic mushrooms, people go, all right, that's just people wearing, wolves' heads and howling at the moon and barefoot and naked and crazy. So it still has that stigma, because of maybe what happened in the 70s or whatever, and certain people might have gone off the rails back in the day. So I guess the main issue, as far as I'm concerned, is that we need to sort of get this information out in a way which is constructive. So it's almost like we have to rebrand the whole exercise to make it palatable for your average person on the street, so they don't think that you interact with psilocybin or have an ayahuasca experience and you're going to sell all your stuff, walk around barefoot, and you're going to fuck your life. You know what I mean? It's like, because that's not ideal, and I want to be like the kind of almost the person that makes it boring. You know what I mean? Like, average guy, middle-aged father, has a normal job. I almost want to be the sort of the person that says, look, you don't have to kind of, start wearing, beads and stuff in your hair or whatever. Do you know what I mean? I've got nothing against that, of course, but just from a mainstream positioning point of view, it makes it difficult when, you know, people think it's just going to make you kind of go crazy and lose your mind. But it's almost like the opposite is true. It's almost like you can, you know, it can sort of have the complete opposite effect. You can have your feet very much under you and much more solid than before, if that makes sense. So we're nearly there, but we've got a long way to go in terms of public opinion. Like a long, long way to go.
Yeah, I also believe the opposite is true, that people that, you know, what is normal now, what consider is normal, is actually less normal than that thing that they criticize. But yeah, we're definitely, I believe we're maybe 10 years away from psychedelics going truly mainstream, and hopefully this time, as opposed to 60s, in a more controlled and a more organized manner. And regarding politics, I think that mental health crisis is not getting any better. It's only getting worse. You know, COVID didn't help, and just the way we live our life and the level of stress. And basically in health, if you look at health, the only aspect of it that didn't progress is mental health. Like, everything was improved in the last 50 years or so, but mental health declined. So, and this is the solution kind of staring at us. And eventually politicians will have to do something about it, because if your population is all, you know, depressed and suicidal and is not able to work, maybe then they will start caring and be like, yeah, you know, maybe it's time for us to do something. There always needs to be some kind of interest. And as of now, obviously, it makes more money to have people take their daily antidepressants and kind of be subdued and quiet and not asking too much questions.
Yeah, I think in many respects, we're looking at trying to construct a more positive narrative for the future. You know, I have children, and I kind of get a bit concerned about the relentless kind of negativity that surrounds them. You know, they're told that, you know, there's going to be environmental collapse, there's going to be, you know, apocalyptic scenarios, there's going to be, you know, everything's going to fall apart. Now, I'm not downplaying the fact that we have huge challenges as a species, and, you know, a lot of our behavior, you know, probably does need to change, you know, in order for us to kind of, you know, have, you know, create that positive narrative. But so take the example of, you know, so traumatic brain injury in athletes. Right. So I also work for a venture which is designed to raise awareness for something like, you know, traumatic brain injury in athletes. Right. You know, currently there's not, you know, there's obviously been a lot of work done sort of by neurologists to try to understand what happens in a traumatic brain injury. But what seems to be happening anecdotally with some of the athletes that I speak to, who've been rugby players or ice hockey players or professional fighters, is that, you know, these individuals have had, you know, multiple concussions, multiple difficulties in their playing careers. The treatment options that they were given at the end of their careers didn't work for them. They then sort of took matters into their own hands and went and had, you know, experiences with different compounds, and then found themselves, you know, in much better health, and in some cases completely cured. Then surely that's something that we should be looking at. You know what I mean? It's like, why would you not look at that? You know, and so I work with, you know, a network of, you know, academics, you know, researchers, you know, individuals, participants, you know, yeah, as I say, you know, the whole kind of range of people, you know, psychotherapists, etc., to try and build a kind of a very robust framework for this, that says, look, you know, if you're skeptical about, you know, the kind of, you know, the safety of these compounds, right, we can go down that way. We can do, you know, the kind of safety studies are quite well known. You know, David Nutt has done quite a lot of work on that here. So we can look at the kind of safety profile, which seems, you know, is fairly solid. We can do, you know, we can do clinical trials. You know, if you're squeamish about ceremonial experiences, we can do the clinical trial route. You know, we can do it, you know, we can do absolutely the best quality science you want. We can do it. You know, so why wouldn't you do that? It just seems like a complete no-brainer, for, you know, for like the governing bodies in rugby, the governing bodies in, you know, ice hockey, the governing bodies in football. You know, why would you not your duty of care to your players, surely would indicate that you would want to at least have the discussion. So this is where we are now. We're trying to, open these doors with governing bodies, open these doors with kind of senior level people of influence to say, we're not advocating that, people go out into the fields and just eat loads of mushrooms and see what happens. We want to do it in a really controlled and structured and safe and responsible way. Complete wraparound care, with proper psychotherapy, with proper trained therapists, with, proper, preparation protocols, quality screening, quality integration, quality kind of, interactions with other types of, healing modalities, be they meditation, breathwork, whatever. Diet's hugely important. We can have a technological kind of approach to it as well. We can track all this through data collection apps, obviously with all the GDPR regulations and, data protection and all that. That's all there. We can do it all completely professionally, and it doesn't have to be, scary. I mean, obviously the experiences themselves can be challenging, no doubt about it. But with the right dose levels, the right preparation, the right medicine for the right person, the right time, with the right structures around them, I'm struggling to see a really good argument against it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's definitely the benefits outweigh the risks, and I do agree with you. It's a matter of time that it gets looked at, and meanwhile, people can just come over here where it is legal, and you can do it properly and traditionally. And I mean, still, I believe in the future when it is legal. Let's say, I mean, mushrooms possibly, but ayahuasca, I mean, it's still there's a certain charm to coming to the country of origin. It's kind of like, it's one thing to eat the Swiss cheese in Brazil or something than to go visit. It's kind of, there's this. It's a little more complex than cheese with psychedelics, because there's a certain spiritual aspect to connection to the land. But I think that legalization is a good thing as long as they do it properly. You said, you're growing up in the age of train spotting. I don't know if people seen this movie, but it's like really gnarly drugs, AIDS, lots of crime, and just kind of like a difficult time. So speaking about drugs, for example, what do you see the potential for the psychedelics to also come in, opioid crisis, and just all the synthetic drugs, like especially like given the situation with your friend, what have you noticed?
Yeah, so interestingly, Scotland, which has a kind of a very shameful sort of statistical record on drugs deaths, so proportionally, Scotland does very badly and is at kind of top of the league tables for drugs deaths. So there's a real realization in Scotland that that something has to be done about this. So what they're kind of looking at is, and it's all very noble and it's all very good, and I'm not criticizing anyone, but they're talking about having safe places to do injections, having clean needles and things like that, and obviously support networks. But to me, it doesn't really get to the root cause of why people are doing it in the first place. And as I say, with my friend, he was a intravenous drug user. I saw the difference in him, and I know it's only one person, it's anecdotal evidence, but yeah, I do see a huge opportunity for a fresh look at this. And Scotland has a devolved government. So Scotland is like, obviously part of the United Kingdom. There's obviously the central government in London, but there's also a certain devolved responsibilities in Edinburgh. And I think health is one of them, or health is one of them. And so I sort of see that there's a huge potential to raise awareness in certain areas. I know there's people talking about even within the police forces themselves. People are looking at potentially, advocating for a fresh look at the PTSD, which is involved in policing itself. So you know what I mean. So there are areas that it's going to be a longer game potentially with obviously the police forces, right? Police force are going to be, nipping over to do ayahuasca anytime soon. There's no way, not right now, but maybe down the line. But yeah, I think absolutely right. There's a huge opportunity for a fresh look, for some pilot studies, to take some, to just have a look at, and let's get the data. I mean, if it's data they need, then let's get the data. If they're not making the decision because they don't have the data, well, let's get them the data then, right? And I know that within the psychedelic community, there's a lot of people who think it should be not medicalized, that it should be, there's a decrim movement, there's a decrim nature movement, it should be, spiritual only. There's kind of purists within the psychedelics community, right? But I personally, I'm like, if it's data they want, let's give them the data that they want. If it has to be done in a clinical setting, it has to be done in a clinical setting. If it needs to be done, okay, fine. And like you say, there are enough places, in Europe, in Amsterdam, in Holland, for example, where people can go. It's only a hop, skip, and a jump from the UK to Holland to do it completely legally. So that will be happening as well. So I guess we've got to do it on all fronts, right? So people who are called to do it safely and responsibly can go to Holland, have the experience, come back. Hopefully they, come back with a positive, story, and it's helped them, hopefully. And then at the same time, we can do the clinical trials, and then we can maybe join the whole thing up. And we just keep advocating, keep trying to raise awareness, keep trying to stress that it's not just pure hedonism. It's not reckless and hedonistic. It's intentional and therapeutic.
Those are very good words, and hopefully somebody will hear you, Joe. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story and sharing your passion. And I really hope that, who knows, let's do another episode 10 years from now when you have achieved your goal and we can celebrate together.
I would love to know your story. I mean, I don't know, much about what you're doing, but obviously, I'd love to, maybe switch it around and ask you about how you got from.
Well, you gotta start a podcast then. This is how it works. Although my story is very simple. I am a 36-year-old man from Latvia originally. I used to work in offshore oil and gas with a bunch of people from Scotland, including. And about 8 years ago, I was really successful. I was making a lot of money, and I reached everything that society told me that by reaching I will be happy, but happiness never came. So I started traveling, quit my job, quit my relationship, ended up in Colombia, and then started working with ayahuasca, changed my life, and now I'm running arguably the best rated ayahuasca retreat in South America, and definitely one of the biggest. I'm focusing on very affordable retreats, authentic, with the real shaman, and good care, good integration, kind of trying to find that grounded balance, as you said, not too much beans and white linen cloth, but like trying to kind of show that it's ayahuasca is potentially for everyone. If you're having an issue, you can come and experience it, and you don't have to be a certain kind of person to do it. And yeah, we battle fear with trust. We have close to 500 5-star reviews on Google and 200 plus video testimonials, so people can see them, and over time, hopefully believe that it is not that dangerous if done properly. But that's my story in a very short.
I'd love to introduce you to some of the people that we're working with, because there's such an important need for for people like yourself who operate with integrity, because unfortunately, sadly, it's not always the case. And particularly, vulnerable people, women, need to have that absolute guarantee that they're safe and that they're being handled with care. Because obviously, the increase in interest in this is going to attract people, and anything that attracts people attracts money, and anything that attracts money attracts humanity at its worst. So, yeah, no, I'm great respect for what you're doing, and if the stars align, then maybe one day we'll sit together.
Well, it looks like every time you go to drink ayahuasca, you go to a different place. So I'm assuming the time has come for you to switch your country as well and experience Jahe, Colombian ayahuasca. I think you're gonna enjoy it, and yeah, we're definitely I mean, I'm really proud of what we have created here. And it would be great for you to see it and experience it yourself. So you are invited. It's an official invitation.
Amazing. I really look forward to it. When it happens, it will be the right thing, because it always is. That's the magic of these things, right? It's like it's always the right thing. When done with proper intention and with a pure heart.
Thank you, Joe. And where can people find you, or some of our listeners from UK? We actually had people participate that were even in the UK government, so you never know. Where can they find you, and maybe even support your cause?
The psilocybin access rights is called par.global, so PAR.global across Instagram and all the usual suspects. That's the psilocybin access rights campaign. I want to give a shout out to Heroic Hearts, because I'm also an ambassador for Heroic Hearts. So Heroic Hearts is, there's a US version, there's a UK version, there's an Australian version, and there's a Canadian version. So Heroic Hearts, big shout out to them. So that's quite easy to find. And then Athlete's Journey Home, which is the new kind of advocacy vehicle for athletes, for head injury, gambling addictions, eating disorders, and so on. So those three things: Par.global, Heroic Hearts, and Athlete's Journey Home.
Thank you for sharing that. We are, I spoke to Ian McCain or McCall, Ian McCall. McCall. Yeah, he was the one who introduced me to you, and he's thinking about coming here in October to Loira, so maybe you can join him. And I had TBI. I used to do boxing actually when I was a teenager, and I had pretty regular headache. I don't know if it was ayahuasca that helped me, but probably it definitely didn't hurt me, because there's some good science showing that psychedelics can help you restore that beaten brain. But for that, go back about maybe 10 episodes. You find my episode with ex-UFC champion Ian McCall, and
Yeah, Ian's he's the founder of the Athlete's Journey Home venture in the US. And I grew up with a boxer, a guy called Ken Buchanan. He was a world champion. He fought Roberto Duran in Madison Square Garden. So boxing is very, very close to my heart. And and if we could find something that can just make the lives of those boxers better, as they when they finish their careers, it'd be something that would be almost like a dream, for me to be able to kind of help people to kind of find that solution. And I'm always very clear. Look, I'm not saying this is the magic bullet. It can be, but miracles do happen. But I'm saying it can be part of the solution. I'm convinced of it. But part of the solution. It's not the one and only solution.
Yeah, those are very wise words. The work will need to be done by you. There is no escape from that. So, guys, you were listening to Ayahuasca Podcast. Hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a conversation with Joe Vaughn. I will add all the links in the description. Joe, thank you for coming on the show.
It's pleasure. Great to meet you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to support us and psychedelic renaissance at large, please follow us and leave us a like wherever it is you're listening. Share this episode with someone who will benefit from this information. Nothing in this podcast is intended as medical advice, and it is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This episode is sponsored by Loira Ayahuasca Retreat. At Loira, we combine affordability, accessibility, and authenticity. Loira, connect, heal, grow. Guys, I'm looking forward to hosting you. Vida de la baila, cura con la guaira, limpia, limpia, taita, viva.